that in 1958, two 9-year-old boys, Gene Greenberg and Larry Pollard, met as neighbors and became best friends. Their fathers had each experienced the hell of war, one as a victim of the Nazis, the other as a soldier and a liberator. The boys made a promise to their fathers to share their family's remarkable experiences and ensure the world never forgets the horrors of the Holocaust. A Promise to Our Fathers is a documentary film that recounts this special story of Holocaust survivors who lost everything but each other, and an Army Air Corps medic who treated survivors in the Dachau concentration camp. It's a moving tribute to the power of survival, to friendship, and to a commitment to make a difference in the fight against anti-Semitism. So we are honored to have both Gene Greenberg and Larry Pollard, filmmakers, with us today to discuss their film. And an interesting connection, another one of their childhood friends is Mark Jacobson. And many of you may know Mark's mother, or may have known her, Ann Jacobson, who is our museum's founding board president. And this year we are celebrating our museum's 20th anniversary. So thanks to Ann, we have had many, many years of providing Holocaust education in the Southwest Florida area. And Mark saw and was deeply moved by this documentary that his childhood friends had made. And he connected me with Gene. So thank you very much, Mark. So let's start us off. Gene, would you just tell us a bit about why you and Larry decided to make this film?
You know, I think those of you out here that are two Gs can maybe relate, especially if you spent any time telling your parents' story. I've been telling their story for years. I've really, since I've gotten to Las Vegas, I've spoken to classrooms a lot and conferences, but I've always wanted to do something more about the story, you know, whether it was a book or a film. And my background pushed me towards doing a film. But I struggled with really how to tell the story. While my parents' story has some uniqueness to it, I really kept looking for a way to tell it differently than the other stories that have been out there. But I really couldn't find that. And then Larry sent me an email. He sent me an email and he talked a little bit about my parents, but then he started telling me about his dad and what his dad was doing. And in all the years we were neighbors, I had no idea that his dad's background, that his dad had been a liberator at Dachau. And Larry told me what his dad was now in a veterans home in Cameron, Missouri. And he told me about this library that his dad was putting together. It was a military and remembrance library because his dad didn't think that students today were learning enough about World War II or the Holocaust. And so Larry and I, you know, we would get together at reunions, but our class was a pretty big class and we usually got to spend 10 or 15 minutes together. All of a sudden, Larry and I were communicating back and forth quite a bit. And I was helping him as much with the library as I could. When Larry told me that the Veterans Home was going to have a dedication of this library, and my wife Melanie and I and my brother and his wife were all going to come back for the dedication, I started thinking about maybe I should hire someone to take some film while we're at the dedication. And with my wife's help, we put together a crew and filmed the dedication, and that really started generating the film. We put together a crew after that to take it one step further. We made another trip to Cameron. We made a trip to Kansas City, and we had the film. And so really it was Larry's email that got this from just an idea sitting on the table to where it is today.
That's terrific. And Larry, tell us more about this library that your father was involved with.
Sure.
And you'll need to unmute yourself, Larry. Yep, so where are the grandchildren when you need them, right?
Hello.
There
it is.
All right. Okay. As Gene said, my father was living at the library, and he had been talking a long time about kids aren't being taught anything, particularly about the Holocaust, and that really bothered him. And so with a lot of help from staff at the library and donations of books, to date, there's been over 1,000 books donated to this library regarding World War II and the Holocaust. And so at the dedication, that kicked off everything. And he had been showing the library and even going out and speaking at different places to students anywhere from 5th grade all the way up into college. And the other thing, of course, that really irritated him were deniers. And so whenever he could, he spoke to those people as well. And as a matter of fact, since Gene was at the library while we did filming, they've already had to knock down a wall and expand the library. It's just grown so much.
Wow.
Now, right now, of course, it's been locked up due to COVID. So there hasn't been really any activity in the veterans home or the library, but we're just waiting for it to be safe again. And then I'm going to go down and start doing some things at the library. And that was basically it. That's why he wanted to start it.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what got the two of you working together on this project,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Terrific. So Gene, back to you. How old were you when you first learned about your parents' experience in the Holocaust and the fact that you had brothers who were killed in Auschwitz? And tell us more about that whole story.
Well, I don't remember not hearing stories about the Holocaust, and I wanted to, since Mark's on here right now, when we started this project, and as you know, in the film, we talk about me telling Larry about the Holocaust in that summer before the 4th grade, and Larry would always tell people that he was my first Holocaust student. Well, we mentioned that on our website, on our school's website, and Mark chimed in and said, that's not true. I remember you telling us about the Holocaust in 2nd grade. So if that gives you an indication, I tell people that, and the 2 G's on here might relate to this too. Um, a Saturday night when I was growing up was my parents and other Holocaust survivors getting together for coffee and dessert. And they would sit there at the table talking about what they went through. And the kids, me included, would be sitting around in the room on the floor playing or something, but we heard everything they said. So I was hearing Holocaust stories again for as long as I can remember. And in turn, apparently telling them starting in the second grade.
Yeah. I mean, you had brothers that you never met.
And they were certainly part of my growing up experience, and for people if there's others that lose siblings and in the Holocaust will understand, but my parents set a standard based on my brothers for my brother and I to live up to. And it was not always that easy.
Mm-hmm.
An example I give a lot of times when I speak is, you don't always like the meal your parents put in front of you. And I can remember if there was something my mom was serving that my brother and I really didn't like, my brother would come back with the line, your brothers would lick the plate clean if they had a meal like this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how my two brothers kind of entered into our lives. Plus their pictures were always around. And
right. So tell us in a summary of what was your parents' experience, if there are a few people who might not have had a chance to screen the documentary yet.
Well, my parents were from Łódź, Poland. They were married and had the two sons before the war started. Like everyone else in Łódź, they then found themselves in the Łódź ghetto. They survived the Łódź ghetto for the entirety. They were transported from the Łódź ghetto to Auschwitz around August 15th of 1944, and the ghetto was completely liquidated by the end of August 1944. When they got to Auschwitz, they were all separated. Both my mom and my dad somehow survived the selection. My two brothers didn't, because they were young and small, and they immediately went to the gas chambers. My dad stayed in Auschwitz, sort of. He was put into one of the sub camps to work in the coal mines, a place called Jaworzno. My mom went from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and then from Bergen-Belsen to a place called Salzwedel. She was liberated in Salzwedel by the Americans around August 14th, 1945. My dad was liberated after his death march from Jaworzno to a place called Lechhammer by the Russians around the end of July or beginning of February 1945. The really remarkable thing is that this couple, my parents, who were married and sent to Auschwitz and separated, and that they both survived different situations, that very few people survived and found each other again after the war. It, it really is, you know, as my dad would say, was very lucky. And that's all you can say, because as we all know, 3,300,000 Jews in Poland, and 90% of them were killed.
Mhm.
And to survive all of that is pretty remarkable.
Right. And then to find each other
To find each other
later.
And there's more to the story of finding each other, which we'll tell at another time.
Right. And then on the other side of the situation, Larry, your father was a liberator at Dachau. And the
Yes.
letter that he wrote in April 2020 at the 75th anniversary of liberation is quite powerful.
Yes, it is. During the filming, and we shot a lot of hours of film between the director, Gene, myself, we would try to get him to speak of his actual experience at Dachau. He struggled with that, as reported in the documentary, but he kept telling me it was closed, you know, the veterans home was closed down, but we talked every night on the phone. And he said, Larry, I have some papers, some more papers I've written that I want you to have, you know, and he kept saying, he wouldn't talk about what it was, but he kept saying, whenever they open this place back up and you come down, he says, I'll give you all these other papers. And then of course, there again, like in the documentary, it states that after he passed away, 6 weeks later, I received all these papers. And while going through them, I found that letter. And I got a hold of Gene immediately because the documentary was getting ready to go and become a DVD. And Gene said, we have got to be able to include that somehow in that documentary. But back to it was like the tail end of the war, the European theater of war. And really, he thought he would be sent on to the Pacific as a medic since we were still in the war with Japan. And one day his commanding officer got a call, stumbled on this place called Dachau, and we need some help. And so there were 3 of the medics out of that unit that the commanding officer sent to Dachau. My father was one of them. So my father had nightmares up until the day he died. And they were, when I was a kid, they were frequent, still very frequent, but I was never told what the nightmares were about. And while he was also at the veterans home, a couple of the ladies that worked there and he would talk to, and I remember one lady telling me that he woke up one morning and he went to the front desk and he says, boy, I had a rough night. And told her, he says, I had one of those nightmares. And she said, when you have these, what are they about? And he says, they're always about Dachau. He says, they're always about the boxcars. They were always about what he saw. And, you know, and even though, and he would always say, even though he saw it, you know, which was unbelievable, but he said, still seeing it was nothing like the millions, people like the Greenberg family that lived it. He said, none of us will ever know because we didn't live it. But yeah, it's quite a story. And unlike Gene, though, when he was when his parents were telling him at a young age, my father on the flip side, yes, I knew he had been in the war. I knew that he also got called back to Korea but I didn't know about, the Holocaust, that part. He never talked about it until later in life.
Now, did your fathers get to meet each other? Were they friends because you were friends, or how did?
That's another funny story. We're not sure. Now, I know my father, who was also in the garment business, he was a clothing salesman. And when he'd get his new samples in, they would come boxed up, and he would get them all out and hang them up. They'd be all wrinkled. And then he'd take them up to tailor shop, the area we live close to, 63rd and Brookside. And that's where Gene's mother worked at the time. So I'm sure they knew each other, but I really don't think my dad and Abe, I don't recall them ever visiting, getting to know each other. Dad traveled a lot. He was on the road most of the time, so he was gone. But I don't know, Gene, but
Yeah, I think most of the communication was our mothers calling each other to find out where we were.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
But when we started discovering all this, it was, really a little puzzling, because Larry's father, Bill, had this experience in Dachau that he couldn't talk about. And right over the backyard fence was a family that had experienced this too, who they could have talked about. The three of them really could have gone through this and worked out some things, but it never happened.
Have either of you been to Auschwitz and or Dachau?
I have been to both.
How was that experience for you?
The Dachau experience happened quite a long time ago, when I was in the Army Reserves, and for some reason the government decided to send this Army Reserve unit from, I think, Laredo, Texas was where I was at the time, to Germany for our 2-week summer training. And while I was there, I took advantage of the long weekend we had, and I got in a train and I went to Dachau. And it was, I don't know if I really comprehended all of it. When it's a museum that these are, that sometimes it didn't fit. But I took some pictures and spent time there. My wife and I went to Auschwitz. Actually, I was in Auschwitz on my birthday, which was very interesting. We were there on a Federation mission. And again, walking through Auschwitz was kind of like walking through, it was walking through a museum. It affected me, but when we stood in the courtyard, and I sat there and I tried to imagine my dad standing there during those long roll calls and what he was going through and all that. And I had a little trouble relating. But then we went that short distance from Auschwitz to Birkenau, which was the death camp and where the trains unloaded. And it hit me, especially standing over a pit of ashes and seeing the crematorium were destroyed, but there was still parts of it there. And it hit me, and I really was having a trouble handling it a little bit. And then I said Kaddish over the pits, and realized I was the first person in my family to ever say Kaddish for my family at that location. And I kind of, it was very emotional and really, it was tough. And and when you realize that we as Jews today go to visit this place and we walk out of it as free people. And we were there, I was there, actually, it was the 45th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And we walked out of Auschwitz and got onto an El Al airplane and flew to Israel. And it was actually my wife reminded me, I think one of the first flights out of Poland, because Poland was still communist at the time, to Israel. And you realize that, what a difference that little country makes to us, that they, if there was an Israel at that time, there would have been someone to take everybody. But it wasn't, we're planning another trip there next summer to see it again under new, with post a lot of the research that I've done since then. So if you haven't been there, you should. It's not an easy trip at all, but it isn't a necessary one, especially if you're a 2G or 3G or I think it helps.
Yeah, to be there, standing on those grounds.
Yes.
Amazing. So you both are obviously committed to Holocaust education and increasing mutual respect between all different kinds of people, fighting against anti-Semitism and discrimination for different groups of people. So tell us some of the things that you're doing. How is this film being used? Would you hope that this film can be used for, and where, et cetera?
Last week, we screened the film for 44 teachers in Las Vegas that are being certified in Holocaust education in Nevada. And it was part of their multi-week class that they take to get certified. I'm vice chair of the Governor's Advisory Council for Education related to the Holocaust in Nevada. And this past legislative session, the state, both houses in the state unanimously passed a Holocaust education mandate. So
that's new for Nevada.
For Nevada, yes. So we're very, very happy with that. We know that in the next session it'll need some tweaking and all that, but it's codified now, and we're very proud of the work we do. We have a Holocaust education student teacher conference once a year, both in Las Vegas and in Reno, which are really two main centers here. And it's very serious here, and I think we're doing a good job in educating the educators and the students. So
that's terrific. And just so our audience realizes, less than half of the 50 United States have a requirement that Holocaust is taught in school. So we are making progress. There are a few more every year, but there's still a long way to go.
I think Larry lives in rural Missouri. We're talking about an area where there are no Jewish people living, but they are making a pretty strong headway in teaching Holocaust in their area, spearheaded by Larry's daughter.
Larry, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, she, of course, she was very close to her grandfather, and you know, she's kind of followed this whole process with the library, and then with what Gene and I have been trying to do, and you know, I made her aware of what our purpose, you know, the purpose of the documentary, to get it out to schools, to other groups for educational purposes at no cost to them, and that type of thing. Well, the year before last at school, they offered her the opportunity to teach a block class. And they told her, you can choose the subject. Well, that just took, the door was wide open. So that's when she chose the combination of Holocaust, World War II. It was received very well. And it's amazing, these students from middle school up, how interested they are in this. I mean, it's great. So then when she was going to do the block class for the current school year, she says, I'm going to dedicate that whole class to just the Holocaust. And that's what she's currently doing. And from that, you know, different other, like friends of hers or teachers at other schools started contacting me. I mean, there was a small school in Southern Iowa, sent them the DVD. That teacher is going to be showing it this year. Macon, Missouri, Trent, Missouri. I mean, it just on and on. These very small towns. I mean, Princeton itself, there's only 1,000 residents in the whole town. And but there was also, of course, my father. Growing up in Princeton, a lot of people knew him. And so when we did release it on DVD, I had a lot of people approach me wanting a copy of it. And we didn't have a service for him in October of 2020 when he died due to the COVID. And so finally, in July, I told my wife, I said, we've got to do something. She says, you're overthinking this. She said, what did your dad actually want? And I said, for a service, just military rights that he was entitled to. She said, that's it. Military rights and a place to show the documentary. And that's what we did for a service. And there were like 50 people showed up, and it was great.
You mentioned that the kids are so interested in this from middle school and on up. And that is how our museum was started. That 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago now, a group of 7th grade students who were studying the Holocaust with their teacher, they got very interested in the subject and they wanted to go deeper and to do more. And that's how Ann Jacobson got involved. They reached out to people in the community, and they created an exhibit in their classroom, and then it was available to the whole school, and then it was available on a weekend to the entire community. And that is the genesis of our museum, because a group of 7th grade students and their teachers, their inspirational teachers, decided that they wanted to do more, that this was such an important topic, and they wanted more people to understand about the dangers of hatred and intolerance and bigotry. So we're all on the same page here, that education of the younger people is so important, that's how we're going to really make a difference in the world. And
right.
So we're glad to be able to share your story as well, and so happy that you're doing that.
Can I?
Now yes, please, Jean.
I just want to say, we've been doing in Nevada the student teacher Holocaust conferences for probably 30 years. And of course, when we started, we had a lot of survivors living in Las Vegas that attended the conference and that spoke to these kids. And I have to say that when they were done, you would think that some of the top rock stars in the country were in that room. The way these students adored and just flooded these survivors for autographs and pictures and all, it was really an amazing thing. Unfortunately, today we maybe have 2 or 3 survivors that can come to the conference and speak, but they're still treated like a rock star. And it kind of shows you how important it is, how important it was to get these survivors out in front of these kids. And when I would be invited to speak in a class, the first thing I would ask the teacher is, have you had a survivor yet? And if they didn't, I wouldn't speak until they had a survivor come and speak, because it was important that they have that first hand contact with the survivor. So, but now it's gotten very, very important for 2Gs, and even the 3Gs need to start getting involved in speaking.
We do have a very active 2G group here in Southwest Florida, Jen Shoah, and they're actually in the midst of a project to write down their parents' stories in a relatively short format, along with a couple of photos, so that we can share those on our website and in other publications. But do you have any words of advice about how do you get started with this process of telling your parents' story, digging into that, very emotional subject?
Well, apparently for me, it just meant sitting down with a couple of classmates and telling them what I heard my parents say. So I'm a little unfamiliar with getting started at it, because it's just been part of me for so long. But we're doing a similar thing here in Las Vegas, because there are a lot of 2Gs that have never done this. And it really is just started writing it down, having some pictures and all that. And then I think in your 2G groups, if you are meeting in person, if you're not, then on Zoom, and telling the stories to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I have to tell you that probably I still have trouble, but certainly the first 20 times I told the story, I couldn't get through it without crying, without having to stop and and collect my thoughts and and wipe the tears away, because it's a tough story to tell. And when you the first times you hear it out loud,
Mm-hmm.
it's tough. I mean, during the film, I was, we would be talking and I would just kind of stop because I couldn't say anything, without breaking up a little bit. So, fortunately with some editing and all that, it works, but
Yeah.
but it's tough, and I think you just got to start doing it, because we need to tell it. Survivors can't tell the stories anymore.
Yeah. Mark just sent a note that he has some comments on this subject.
So I can speak to this issue related to Anne, to my mother. I grew up like Larry in a situation where nothing was said about this, almost nothing. And Anne was not in a concentration camp. Her older brother, my uncle, who I was very close to, was in Dachau for a while. He was picked up on Kristallnacht. This was before the final solution. So he was eventually released, extremely traumatized. My mother was almost murdered on Kristallnacht by stormtroopers. And she was a more resilient person and maybe was less traumatized. But neither of them would speak about this. And Anne finally began to talk about this in the mid-1990s after Schindler's List was very successful. Steven Spielberg gave a lot of money to the University of Southern California to establish an oral history project. It's called the Shoah Project. And she was invited to give testimony. And that just opened the floodgates for her. One of the only relatives who, outside of her nuclear family, who was not exterminated, lived in San Francisco. I was very, very close to her. She also was invited. And when I and my family watched these DVDs, we heard more than we had heard in a lifetime. You know, and I know that they do, the Shoah Project does this fabulous job, but just, I mean, anybody can, you know, who has an iPhone or a Galaxy or whatever can take an oral history and video it. And that might be one way to open up.
The recorded testimonies are so important. We have had a very active project here at our museum to record stories since the beginning almost of our museum. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of those. And a new project that we're doing is working with our local theater company to create short plays about the lives of some of our survivors. And so far they have now written and produced 2 plays. First one was about Sabine Van Dam, and the second one, which will be introduced this year, is about Abe Price, who I think was very close to Anne Jacobson, also one of the early founders of our museum. So it's another way, rather than watching a video, but to have something that is live on stage. And these plays are designed to be between 20 and 30 minutes, so they can be performed during a classroom period, in a classroom, and also for the general public. So there's lots of ways that we need to keep these stories alive, and all the creative people out there who can make films and make plays and write books and all of that is very important. I'm just really still thinking so much about the education piece, and it's so wonderful that Larry, your father, was able to create this library. You know, he really did that towards the end of his life, right? And
Yes.
I think I saw in the documentary that there's a framed photograph of the Greenberg family in that library.
He had that, he wanted that hanging in there. And then he used it when he would be explaining to students, he would try to explain, look, there's a million stories out there, but right here, these people, this is one, they were our neighbors. This is what they went through.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he had that.
Right.
And he had a funny story. He had, when he would go on a speaking engagement, he didn't want that picture removed from the library to take with him. So the staff at the veterans home had an exact same picture, framed and everything, that he could use when he would go out to speak to other people. I have that picture here at my house now, but it was funny. He says, no, you're not removing that picture. Even when I go speak to somebody, it stays right there.
Mm. Yeah. You know, the personal stories, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, that is what is so important. That's what can connect people with the humanity and the inhumanity of these stories.
Yeah.
Because, you know, as they say, 1 million deaths is a statistic and 1 death is a tragedy. It's hard to relate to these numbers. What is 6 million? But when you hear about what these human beings endured, and the story of, gets me choked up, the story of Simon and Samuel, who were murdered, little
Yes.
boys who had done nothing to anyone. You know, it's just, it makes it real.
Probably one of the most powerful things to me, and it should be to others about the documentary, is the fact that Gene took the time in 1981 to just sit there and film his mom and dad and let them just speak. You know, it's one thing to tell their story, but to actually see them telling the story, you know, that is so powerful.
Well, I would like to thank you all for sharing your stories with us. Keep telling your stories. And I encourage all of our 2Gs here and 3Gs to keep telling the stories. And to join us as we're going to keep telling more stories. Thank you to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Jean, Larry, and Mark. Best wishes.